Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the September monthly meeting, Society of Antiquaries of Newcastle. It's a great pleasure to welcome Michelle, who's a Professor Emerita of many medieval manuscript studies at the School of Advanced Study, University of London. And she's a visiting professor at University College London. She was formerly curator of illustrated manuscripts at the British Library, and she's lectured, published, and exhibited and broadcast widely on medieval culture, notably that of early Northumbria. Her books include the Lindisfarne Gospels, Society, Spirituality, and the Scribe, a book on the art of the islands, on early medieval visual culture, and the book that she's launching today, Bede and the Theory of Everything.
Thank you very much. Well, what an amazing place and what amazing people. I should start, I'm not going to apologise, but I should just explain that it's a very difficult thing to be a Hiberno-Northumbrian trapped in a southeast London accent. My maternal granddad, Billy Crow, walked down to London in the Jarrow Marches and stayed to work on the East India docks. So that's how that came to happen. And Dad was coming back from Egypt back to Ireland and met Mum in the East End and never got any further. But I am thinking of getting further. We're in the process of trying to move to the northeast. And so I hope that one day you might let me into the society. But let's not run before we can walk. You may not let me anywhere near after tonight. So yet another book on Bede. Of the writing of books, there is no end. Bede would love that. There's always something new to say. Sometimes it's new discoveries, sometimes it's new technologies, mostly it's new perspectives. There's a little bit of hope of all of those in the new book, but for me, it is a bit of a personal act of piety towards Bede, as the Lindisfarne Gospels was towards Cuddy and Eadrith. But also it's a tribute to joined up thinking and the long view, qualities that I'm finding a little bit lacking around me at the moment and that I want to wish to encourage. And Bede was a great one for thinking on the good. And so I'm going to think on Bede as part of the good. A couple of years back, just before COVID, I was invited to Westminster to address a set of politicians, senior civil servants and church people. And it was myself and Rory Stewart. And they wanted to know about what happened the last time the global superpower of the West went into freefall. The Western Roman Empire in the 5th century. They obviously thought there were some points of synergy with the present. At the end of the talks, one got up and said, "You're surely not suggesting we're going into another dark age?" "Oh, I shouldn't imagine it would be that bright," I said. But no, seriously, we do not talk about the dark ages any longer. I said, what you will find if you listen to the talks and follow up on them is that it was a time of transformation. It was a time of possibility, opportunity. It was a time of great danger. And we're talking about real people in situations of dilemma and doubt. And what made the difference back then wasn't empires, wasn't governments per se. It was ordinary men and women, and sometimes children, putting themselves into the breach, serving each other, creating sustainable communities. And out of that came an incredible new cultural and political expression of what we now call the successor states. And a shining light within that, of course, is Northumbria. And Bede emerges as one of the greatest thinkers in the West of the post-classical early Christian world. He's also the only church father to come from these islands. Bede is the English patristic. And I had a wonderful email from an archaeologist who has been specialising in porphyry. Are you here? Are you here? Who tells me, and I didn't know this, and I will go and find out more about it, that at the entrance to St. Peter's Basilica in Rome is a porphyry roundel on the floor, which is said to have Bede buried underneath it as a mark of honour. And people don't tread on that porphyry as they go through. They go around it and honour Bede. Well, there were probably lots of relics of Bede, as indeed there were of Cuthbert. And so who knows, but I should be interested to find out more. But it is peculiarly apt because if you look at the pages of the Lindisfarne Gospels, you'll see 40 shades of purple and a great deal of chemical knowledge that's gone into creating 40 shades of purple out of the little grey-green lichen, that orchil that grows on our shores. And when Eadfrith prepared that, using acidity and alkalinity to vary the colour, he wasn't just doing that for aesthetic appeal. He was doing it because Bede was writing tracts on the temple and the tabernacle that tell us about the 40 shades of purple that were used for the temple hangings and ornaments in Jerusalem, and their significance and symbolism for the journey of the soul. And this is the world that we're about to venture into, one replete with symbolism, one replete with connections and wires coming together. To quote Bede, "My chief delight has always been in study, teaching, and writing." Hands up if that applies to you. There are other things as well that give one delight, but chief delight. So wrote Bede in Old English, an Anglo-Saxon born in northeastern England in 673, we think, and this, as has been mentioned, is the 1350th anniversary of his birth, and he died there in 735, having lived as a priest and a monk in the Northumbrian twin monastery of Wearmouth Jarrow. And he wrote those words in the autobiographical note with which he concludes his most famous work, the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, completed in 731, according to the unified dating system from the birth of Christ, which he established in popular use in the West. Now, Dionysius Exiguus, which basically means Dionysius the vertically challenged, or the very, very humble, had started that process a couple of centuries earlier, but Bede refined it. He brought an awful lot more data into play. Bede is, in many respects, the first computer. And to actually be able to unify all of the different regnal years, the imperial indictions, and the different churches' calendars, even of the West and the East, let alone what lay beyond, and to form a synthesized, unified calendar as part of his attempt to end a controversy that had rumbled on since the Council of Nicaea in the early 4th century, and which was tearing the churches of the East and now the West asunder, is quite a remarkable thing in and of itself. And that's one of the main things that if people have heard of him at all, that they might know about. That and the fact that he was venomous, 1066 and all that. Venerable, he is the only venerable Englishman. And this again is from the autobiographical note, and it sets out part of Bede's research methodology and agenda. Thus, much of the ecclesiastical history of Britain, and more especially of the English nation, as far as I could learn, either from the writings of the ancients, the tradition of our forefathers, or my own knowledge with the help of the Lord, I, Bede, the servant of Christ and priest of the monastery of the blessed apostles Peter and Paul at Wearmouth and Jarrow, have set forth. Having been born in the territory of that same monastery, I was given by the care of kinsmen at 7 years of age to be educated by the most reverend Abbot Benedict and afterward by Ceolfrith, and spending all the remaining time of my life a dweller of that monastery, I wholly applied myself to study of scripture, and amidst the observance of monastic rule and the daily charge of singing in the church, I always took delight in learning or teaching or writing. In the 19th year of my age, I received deacon's orders. in the 30th, those of the priesthood, the traditional time of coming into your public ministry as Christ did. Fortunately, Bede had longer than 3 years. Both of them by, and in 30th, those of the priesthood, both of them by the ministry of the Most Reverend Bishop John and at the bidding of Abbot Shalfrith. From the time when I received priest orders till the 59th year of my age, I have made it my business for my own needs and those of my brethren to compile out of the works of the Venerable Fathers the following brief notes on the Holy Scriptures, and also to make some additions after the manner of the meaning and interpretation given by them. So, why are we here to think about a trusty old monk who came into a monastery when he was 7 years old, and as far as we know, only ever got as far as Holy Island? Not a bad place to head for. What I want to do is to open him up and think about the little boy of 7, given perhaps not by his parents, but by his kinsmen, to a new monastery with buildings that were the Mies van der Rohe modernism of their day. St. Peter's, Monk Wearmouth, founded in 674, and then Jarrow, St. Paul's, whence he moved after its foundation in 681. But you would have had a lifelong association with those two monasteries. And we know there's a little bit of rivalry sometimes between Wearmouth and Jarrow. Bede was here. No, he was here. Bede was there. He was everywhere. One of the greatest, most read authors of the Middle Ages. But think of that little boy coming into that environment. Think of him getting under everybody's feet. Think of him seeing the first molten glass poured to make those stained glass windows. Think of him seeing the masons carving More Romanum, the work of giants that still littered the landscape in places like the Fort of Arbea and Hadrian's Wall. Think of him looking up in amazement at the pictures that clothed the walls of both of those churches that Biscop and Shalfrith had brought back from Rome and the continent during their 6 journeys. And on one of those journeys alone, they took 84 men with them. Think of the carts that would have rumbled back over the Alps. Think of the journeys by water that mopped up the remains of the great libraries available in Italy and Gaul at that time that they knew of, possibly including that of Cassiodorus, the great Roman senator, founder of the Vivarium, the monastery of the living things, dedicated to accurate study, copying, and transmission of scripture, which inspires the beginning of publishing in Wearmouth Jarrow, which in turn, through Alcuin of York, inspires the publication programs of the Carolingian Empire. Think of him ploughing through as many of those books as he possibly could. He would have had a voracious appetite. But think, if you will, that it's a mere 40 years or so, 50 years since his people first received the message of Christianity, living in something vaguely akin to the Wild West of America in terms of the big fish eat little fish, extortionism, protectionism, and war-banned environment. It's quite remarkable. And the journey that we're going to see when the Codex Amiatinus is taken by Shalfrith to the Pope as a present in 716, it goes as an ambassador for the English church and nation, neither of which were even remotely conceived of before Bede. He creates an English identity, and that, of course, is something which is rather politically incorrect today. We're not allowed to say Anglo-Saxon anymore, apparently, but we do. It's a cultural term, and it's a term about an archaeological people who have a very distinctive identity, law codes, etc. But it's because Bede was an Angle that we're English, not Saxonish or Jutish or any other ish. Okay. And I think what for me pervades his work is the fact that he He has his blind spots, like all of us. He's working at an early stage of development of our knowledge through a glass darkly. But Bede's life work and the research programme that I've sought to actually study more in this book and make more sense of how it's joined up is something which is seeking ultimately to look for harmony and unity. Bede was a great advocate of Pliny's principle that beauty is truth and good. And when he tries, I think, within aspects of his work, whether it be exegesis, whether it be his scientific writings, or whether it be his human history, he is looking to actually acknowledge differences, acknowledge anomalies, but he's ultimately seeking to try and establish a unity in diversity that he sees as a harmony that brings everything together. And so for the title of the book, I've chosen Bede and the Theory of Everything. Now, a TOE, T-O-E, in scientific terms, is a hypothetical framework explaining all known physical phenomena in the universe or multiverse. Researchers have searched for such a model ever since the development of quantum mechanics and Einstein's relativity in the early 20th century. Oh, has anybody seen Oppenheimer yet? What an amazing wake-up call and erudite labour of love that film is. Please do see it. Now, each of those pillars of modern physics describes its respective area of inquiry, the very smallest and the biggest things in the cosmos, with astounding accuracy, but quantum mechanics and relativity fail when applied to each other's subject matter. And so far, an overarching theory of everything has eluded scientists, and some believe the ultimate goal is unrealistic. And this, of course, is one of the great carpet pages, a detail from the Lindisfarne Gospels. This is the Celtic ringhead cross that introduces Mark's Gospel, and laid out according to Pythagorean and Euclidean geometry, okay, with a practical chemistry and experimental chemistry underpinning it. And Bede, of course, as we'll see, had a hand in the making, I think, of the Lindisfarne Gospels, and certainly his relationship with Bishop Eadfrith was a very formative factor within that. And I would suggest that part of the thinking behind Eadfrith's visualization, as we might call it in modern digital terms, of that eternal harmony expressed through the synthesis of science, the arts, humanities, and faith, is an expression of wide reading within Bede's oeuvre and that of some of his sources. Einstein wrote, "I want to know how God created the world," said that in 1925. "I'm not interested in this or that phenomenon, in the spectrum of this or that element. I want to know his thoughts. The rest are just details." Not quite what we think about modern scientific objectivity, perhaps. During the mid-20th century, physicists developed the Standard Model, the theory of almost everything, which describes the interactions of all known subatomic particles and three of the four fundamental forces, electromagnetism and the strong and weak nuclear forces, but not gravity. Anybody know who the first is to actually conceive of gravity? Bede, who through his own observations, through his calendrical observations and his standing out on Jarrow Slate on a starry night, etc., actually works out gravitational pull of the moon as part of his writing of the first tide timetables. A model that also included gravity would be known as quantum gravity theory, technical stuff. Some researchers believe that string theory is such a framework and fits the theory, but basically nobody agrees on this at the moment. In his best-selling book, A Brief History of Time, Stephen Hawking discussed his desire to create a theory of everything, but he changed his mind later in life and thought that such a theory would be out of reach forever because human descriptions of reality are always incomplete. But this gives him hope. I'm now glad our search for understanding will never come to an end, and we will always have the challenge of new discovery. Without it, we would stagnate. I can almost hear Bede saying, hurrah. But when we look at visualizations such as those of the Hadron Collider, and we look at Bede and Eadfrith's vision, I think we're not actually a million light years away from one another, because what Bede does is actually in his age to create a theory of everything, and his research program and his intellectual curiosity throughout life, examining the nature of things, writing encyclopedias, picking up from Pliny the Elder and Isidore of Seville on the nature of things, writing on the nature of time and the calculation of time, writing orthographies, writing tracts on rhetoric, writing on human history, situating his people as the new children of Israel. His love of pop songs, his love of his own language, his love of visual symbolism and metaphor and allegory and analogue, etc. All of these come together, and underpinning it of all, of course, is his faith, his spirituality. I'm sure for Bede, God wasn't an old man with a beard. For Bede, it's the cosmic logos. It's the enormity of this. And of course, both Hawking and Einstein, in their different ways, both expressed at times the reason that they couldn't encompass a theory of everything in their work is because they lacked the spiritual dimension. As the language of quantum and theology draw ever closer together, who knows? But Bede really does conceive of a bigger picture and bigger ways of expressing things. So, Weymouth and Jarrow with their still remaining 7th century fabric. And when I talk to people at Weymouth Jarrow, and I'm going to be giving Weymouth lecture on Saturday morning at 11, and then in Jarrow in the afternoon, 3 till 5, a different lecture there. I think what I would like to say to them is don't pull the twin monastery apart. Bring it closer and closer together. Because, of course, the second monastery joining the first in 681 to 2, I think is a direct result of Benedict Biscop's Chalfrith's part in helping the new Archbishop of Canterbury, Theodore of Tarsus, the most educated man of the Eastern Mediterranean, to actually stage a G7 pre-summit for the Great Sixth Ecumenical Council in Constantinople in 681. It was held in Hatfield outside of London in 679. Biscop was a major player within it. And it sought to actually put to bed one of the biggest controversies that was tearing the church apart. And that was, how can Christ be human and divine? A bit like Patrick and the three-leaf shamrock for the Trinity. The conclusion of Hatfield, which was then passed in Constantinople a couple of years later, is that they are indivisible, because the human nature of Christ always obeyed the divine will. And the great symbols of that are the nativity, when he accepts birth in human form, and the crucifixion, when he accepts death on the cross. And those two iconographies start gaining popularity in both the East and the West, and certainly in Northumbria from that point onwards. And so what we have, I think, is a second monastery, St. Paul's, joining the first, St. Peter's, and Bede refers to them as two places with but one will. They are the ultimate symbol of the indivisible human and divine will. Now, I'm sure nobody wants to tear those apart, so Weymouth Jarrow, let's bring it together. Another thing that Bede does, having only ever travelled as far as Lindisfarne, is, of course, write one of the best travel guides to the Middle East. This is St. Catherine Sinai, where one of my current research programmes is based. Well, I've got two Northumbrians of the mid-8th century writing in the scriptorium there. They got about, okay. And Bede's De Locis Sanctis on the holy places actually was still being used as a Baedeker guide in the early 20th century. But he wrote it as a journey of the spirit and the imagination, primarily, for himself and others. He was working partly from the notes that Adovnan of Iona is said to have made from a visit of a bishop from Gaul, Arculf, who took a wrong turning at Land's End on his way back home from the Holy Land in a bad storm, and instead of going up the Channel, ends up going up the Celtic Sea and spending Christmas on Iona, dictating his recollections of his journeys to Adovnan and drawing plans of the holy places on wax tablets. Well, whatever the truth of that, and I think we can now say that certainly people were travelling and in both directions. Bede uses that and his deep reading of biblical text and archaeology and other texts, as Josephus, he seems to have had some knowledge of, to actually flesh out this vision of the Holy Land that bore a remarkably lifelike resemblance to some of those areas. So we talked about Bede the computer. I'm sorry, it's a short lecture, so I can't go into all of the nitty-gritty about these. But basically his temporal vision and his chronological vision, it's a bit like a Celtic ring-headed cross. You've got the temporal vertical, you've got the spatial horizontal, and you've got the quantum eternal of the ring head. And so Bede's research kind of fits in to how they relate to one another in a moving multi-dimensional grid. And it's fascinating how he actually follows through his agenda. And if you look at what he was working on when, and he seldom just sits down and writes one book. Didn't have publishers nagging him either, but you know, everything's joined up. So another hair will start running and he will sometimes head off because he can't fully comprehend what he's writing about until he's scratched that particular itch as well. And yeah, you're smiling, Max, I know. We've all been there. And so the research agenda is particularly interesting. He also plays a very interesting part, I think, in the story of Lindisfarne. Towards the end of his life, he becomes increasingly Bolshe, it would appear. In fact, it's not Bolshe, but he's always shown an interest in his writings, for example, in his verse and prose life of Cuthbert, his lives of Felix, Anastasius, and the ecclesiastical history in issues relating to social justice and society. He's got, we know, a great deal of time for Aidan, Cuthbert, Columba, and the Celtic camp. He's got less time for the British. The problem with that is that he sees the British still as schismatic. By 715, the Iona, the last bastion of Columban traditions and independence in the aftermath of Whitby, finally adheres to the orthodoxy of Chalcedon. And of course, this early period, we're part of the Orthodox Church. Don't think Roman Catholicism. Gregory the Great is the westernmost of the Eastern patriarchs, the poor relation, who writes to the boss in Constantinople saying, why have I been left as the captain of the leaky bark of the West? I want to go to St. Catherine's in Sinai and have candles and incense and icons and perhaps be a hermit. It's a very different world. But they've conformed. The British churches, of course, haven't. The Cornish is the last one to come around to Orthodox practices in the 12th century. And so for Bede, they are the component which is disrupting, in human temporal terms, his vision of everybody working together. So, and that coupled with the fact that his own people, the Angles, are still engaged in expansionist activities within British territory, means that you've got an active degree of sometimes enmity. And Bede is human. So that's the fly in the ointment. But towards the end of his life, it becomes apparent that his so-called sponsor, Acca of Hexham, is following on from Wilfrid of York's agenda and is trying to establish a neat, revived Roman hierarchical structure for the church in Northumbria, within which the supra-territorial awkward brigade, the Celts, have no place. And there is actually an attempt, it would appear, to try and abolish the monastery on Lindisfarne. And Bede is having none of it. Because an awful lot of the Historia Ecclesiastica is actually talking about the process of conversion and civilization of his people and the role of both the Columban mission and those of other key figures, be they from Gaul, be they from Rome, be they from Ireland, within that process, or Wales within that process. So he starts writing. He writes a letter to Egbert, the Archbishop of York, basically saying, don't let this happen. And basically, you bishops have got to take more responsibility for the pastoral and sacramental care of your people and not be princes of the church and pen pushers. Oh gosh, it also, anyway, let's not go there. Right, and so this is a factor of it. Did you know that Bede also invented footnotes? At one point earlier in his career, the humble priest monk is actually entrapped at a dinner party. Can't imagine Bede went to many dinner parties, but anyway, he made a mistake this time. And some of Wilfrid's coteries start turning a bit nasty and edgy and accusing him of the heresy of innovation. Because, of course, you stand on the shoulders of giants to see further. It's like legal law of precedent. What do you mean plucking all these ideas out of the ether on your own head? Of course, they're not as well read as Bede. They haven't a clue about Ephraim the Syrian or John Chrysostom, etc. And so he explains and he covers his tracks. And in future, when he cites an authority, he writes their initial in the margins. He also develops a magic marker yellow pen equivalent of little lightning flashes. And I saw one of those today in the epigraphy at Arbea. It's a Roman symbol. And he writes those in the margins to show when he's quoting. So he starts thinking about the graphic articulation of text. He thinks about his sources. He explains to people how he's got written sources, he's got oral sources. And of course, he has a great research network. He sends out the equivalent of emails in the form of people like Nothelm, who becomes Archbishop of Canterbury ultimately. And they ask people for help for him where they go, be it Rome, be it Barking. And of course, the Barking nuns, or rather the nuns of Barking, play a very leading role in his research, as Paula did for Jerome. And we probably know a little bit more about Essex girls than we need to in the Historia Ecclesiastica as a result. But people answered his research calls. So his network had very long tentacles. Yeah, so think about the calculation of time, think about offshoots such as the tide tables and the way in which just working on the calculus of time leads you into the observation of an incredible amount of issues within the natural world. And of course, for maritime people like those of much of Northumbria, knowing your tide timetables is very important. And we've all seen SUVs on the causeway with people standing on their roofs. Holy Island. Now, this is a copy of his De Temporum. It's a 12th century copy. After his death, he becomes immediately sought after as an author. People are clamouring for his works, and within 5 to 10 years of his death, the scriptorium at Monk Wilmot Jarrow is evidently turning out quite a lot of copies. There are 4 copies of the Historia Ecclesiastica from within 10 to 15 years of his death. Now, that as a sample is incredibly high. When I started as a medieval historian archaeologist, we were told there was about 5% possibly of what we think was there physically remaining. When I left the British Library as a digital curator, our estimate was from the first 5 generations of born digital scholars and society, we're going to retain about 5%. Okay, so that is a very high sample. Charlemagne, Alcuin of York, many others expressed interest in acquiring his work. In the 12th century, the scholastics in the proto-university system rediscovered him, and they like to add diagrams to help clarify. I think Bede would have really liked this, and there are some senses in which he uses them earlier. And this is something that shows rapid finger reckoning. So it's using your fingers as a decimal abacus. for advanced calculation. But the symbols at the bottom show that you can also use some of the same symbols for sign language in the monastic environment for times of the year or the day when you couldn't speak. So if you want to say, pass the pepper in the refectory, there are symbols for so doing. Now, in the mid-11th century, Bede's relics were obtained from Jarrow by the wonderful Alfred Westow, who would do anything to obtain a good relic, it seemed, and they joined Cuthbert in his coffin. But in 1370, Bede's relics were translated to the Galilee Chapel in Durham Cathedral, and I think that's got a particular synergy because, of course, the Galilee Chapel is where the poorer sort of pilgrims tended to be rounded up, and that pernicious but deeply spending component, women, who weren't at that point allowed into the church itself, but Bede was there to receive them. And of course, his works show a great deal of empathy and sympathy for women, such as Etheldreda in her attempts to leave King Edfrith of Northumbria and to become a nun, but the many women who appear on the pages of his works. I'm going to have to skip an awful lot of this. So, yeah, there's not enough time. One thing I just want to say about his boyhood is that it's interesting that both the names Biscop and Badeking, which are Benedicts, and Bede both occur in the early king list of Lindsey, which was an Anglian kingdom in East Anglia. And it's possible that they're both sort of vaguely king-worthy. So it's possible that there may have been some sort of family connection and that they were from the upper echelons of early Anglo-Saxon society. Just throw that into the mix. That was too much. Okay. So, in a way, the culture of Northumbria at this period is a bit of a mongrel. It's at its best when genetically it draws upon all of the different influences, when it draws deep into the prehistoric Iron Age and the Roman past, when it draws upon the British, Romano-British tradition, when it draws upon that of its Celtic neighbours, when it draws upon its own deep Germanic roots, and when it looks towards the continent and the wider world stage. So we have within 40 to 50 years already beginning to be constructed an incredible recreation and imagining of a people, and Bede's scholarship and what Chalfrith and Biscop are doing at Wearmouth Jarrow is an incredible part of that. The library that was established is what really gives Bede the ability to do this. And we know, for example, that one book, a copy of the Cosmographers, which probably had things like Cicero's Latin translation of the Phenomena of Aratus, the Aratea, and the Cosmographers. It might even have had some medical works such as Dioscorides in there. There's a lot of debate about that. But anyway, this book of the Cosmographers, which is thought to have been illustrated, was given by Wearmouth Jarrow to King Aldfrith, the educated part Irish king, who had a lot to do with sponsoring the monasteries as well. And that one book, he gives them some land in return, and it's on a prime riverine site. It's enough to support 8 families. Now, what we know, or what we can reconstruct of the land holdings of Wearmouth Jarrow, that represented about 1/10 of the overall property holdings. So imagine what this incredible library represented as a financial resource, let alone a cultural resource. And it really does help to plug that transition from the post-Roman period into the early Middle Ages intellectually. If those materials hadn't been salvaged and studied in Wearmouth Jarrow and in Canterbury and a few other key centres, the Carolingian Renaissance would have struggled, for sure, and it partly grows out of that work. Right, I'm going to fast forward, if I may. Right, okay, so we go from this to this. Now, Ezra is a particularly important image for Bede. This is in the Codex Amiatinus. Bede first presents him as an Old Testament type of Christ. Okay. Ezra the scribe the priestly scribe, who is said to have written down from memory the Hebrew scriptures after they'd been burnt in the temple fire by the Babylonians shortly before 600 BC. Now, that's a cipher for a process of orality into written culture that probably took several hundred years. But Ezra comes to symbolize that. And I'm sure you're all very familiar with the deconstruction of this image. Multivalent symbolism is something that was taught in the schools of Wearmouth Jarrow, as indeed in Canterbury. Ultimately, it has a rabbinic Kabbalistic origin in Pardes, the garden of flowers, in which you use many critical skills to gather and garner deeper meaning. Now, what that means basically is if we were watching a French film noir, boys' team might be saying, not a lot of action, is there? Where's the storyline? And girls' team are saying, oh, but think how the major protagonists resemble Abelard and Eloise and the connections between their relationship. And Smarty Pants at the back is saying, don't be ridiculous, it's all about Jean-Paul Sartre. Now, you can read it at all or any of those levels, and the lens can focus in and out, and it depends what you as the readers have got on the shelves of your inner library, as Kumi and the Sage of Iona and Cassiodorus would say, authors whom Bede and others knew well, as to how you can interpret things, okay? But of course, this is not just Ezra in the Old Testament. The 9 volumes in the bookcase, the armorium behind, are thought to represent one of the 3 editions of the Bible that Cassiodorus undertook in the 6th century in the south of Italy at the Vivarium, and his library and his teachings are very influential at Wearmouth Jarrow. So it's the Novem Codices. So it's, and if you take a magnifying glass and look at the spines, it's all the different authors who have edited scripture. It's Origen, it's Jerome, it's Augustine, etc. So it's an ongoing transmission of scripture diagram with Christ as the ultimate interface. And of course, it's Bede and it's Chalfrith and those who were responsible for writing scripture in Wearmouth Jarrow. And at this period, in order to write scripture, you needed to be pretty spiritually tough. You needed to be the Bear Grylls of the monastic world. Okay. And in his autobiographical note, Bede writes, in this, as in all things of monastic humility, I was both author, notary, and scribe. Now, in antiquity and the Middle Ages, it's not normal for an author to pick up the pen. It's voice-activated computing. You dictate. Okay, we've got a few exceptions, Matthew Paris, Christine de Pizan, etc., and Bede. I thunk it. I wrote it myself, but I am also a scribe. And in that sense, he's talking about himself as a scribe of scripture. Scribes and Pharisees in the Old Testament sense, a priestly calling. Ipso facto, Bede writes scripture, which is the place that writes the biggest, bestest copies of scripture of its age, Wearmouth Jarrow. In the claims that I put forward in the book for possibly identifying the Holy Grail of Bede's script and his lost translation of John's Gospel into Old English, part of that was motivated by the fact that we haven't got a smoking quill, but reading Bede's works, reading his personal notes on his modus operandi and his motivation, you can bet your life he is one of the hands in the Chalfrith Bibles, the 3 great single volume Bibles that Chalfrith commissioned of the Monk Wearmouth Jarrow Scriptoria, one to be taken as a present to the Pope as an ambassador for England, which he does in 716, one to be left for Monk Wearmouth and one for Jarrow, so that more authentic, well-researched copies could be made and published, which is what Alcuin then transports later in the century to the Carolingian orbit. Okay, he has to be in there. He's not only, I think, the leading intellectual light behind the work, and of course, we're not just talking about Wearmouth Jarrow having something like the Novem Codices and copying an earlier copy of Jerome's Vulgate, the most reliable, well-researched copy of the Bible in the vernacular of the Roman Empire, Latin, which was undertaken in the Holy Land in the 380s. They don't have that pure copy. They are doing the research and reconstructing Jerome's own research path in order to be able to do this. And when the Vulgate first comes to be printed in the Counter-Reformation in the 16th century, and scholars examine as many copies as they possibly, early copies as they can find of the Vulgate, they find that Codex Amiatinus is the purest evocation of Jerome's original work, with the Lindisfarne Gospels for the Gospels using a copy of the Wearmouth Jarrow text, which has been sent on interlibrary loan via Bede and his relationship with Eadfrith, or a copy made for them to use as part of the making of the Lindisfarne Gospels, but without illustrations and decoration, in a much smaller format, in a different script. So Lindisfarne is a great act of engagement and creation and recreation in itself. Now, the late, great Rosemary Cramp's model of Jarrow that you see here, it's possible that the little building at the end here, so you've got the communal refectory dormitory area here. You've got the two churches, the Gemini churches, one for the public and pilgrims and one for the community. And then you've got a building which she interpreted as possibly the abbot's lodging, with a little room at the end with an altar and another room attached to it, which it's been suggested may have been where Bede taught and would have been responsible for the younger children and those in early stages of learning that you would want to perhaps keep a little outside of the communal whole. And it's possibly there that Bede died in 735, having started his journey at Monk Wearmouth and pursued his research and his teaching in both monasteries throughout his the remainder of his 62 years. And what does this mean? Well, we might think it's hard for a child to be given into an institutional upbringing of strangers and to stay there for the rest of their lives. I can think of a few Oxbridge dons who've done pretty much the same, from boarding school at an early age and basically remained in the universities that they have studied in. What does he get in return? Well, he gets nice buildings with glass. You're not actually subject to being kippered by fires and the drafts and agues and chest infections perhaps that other people were coping with. So okay, materially he gets regular meals, not particularly lavish ones. He's got to be a vegetarian and only drink water, but hey, they're regular. But what he does get is time. He gets time, he gets space, he gets the techniques, he gets the resources, and he gets the stimulus in which to be and to think deeply. Possibly not a bad trade. There were those who tried to show that Bede was married. You ever come across that? And that he wasn't actually a monk, he was just a priest. He writes about monastic humility all the time. And the two places in which he speaks about his wife, it's in the same sense as Solomon in the Song of Songs talks about the church or the temple as his bride. Okay, so I think we can dispense with that. But for the first 7 years of his life, he would have been living in hall, and there would have been people, probably the dark noises of the night. There wasn't a lot of privacy in your personal relationships. He would know about people, even from that early start. And it certainly shines forth in his works. I haven't got time to do all of this, but it's all in the book. This is some of the styli and the portable altar from Jarrow that are from Bede's period that attest to some of the learning there. And of course, when Benedict Biscop comes back from one of his trips, he's also been studying on an island off of the French coast called Lorraine, which is where one of the great Eastern Desert Fathers, John Cassian, had established his style of eremitic monasticism that had also influenced St. Patrick and which also influenced the Columban Church. And Bede is very drawn to that. It's not only the Cenobitic communal, more military style of Martin of Tours and even of Saint Benedict. It's far more diverse. And on one of his trips back, Biscop is called upon to accompany Theodore of Tarsus to become Archbishop of Canterbury after the Synod of Whitby a couple of years later in 669. And with him, he brings Abbot Hadrian, who had recently been in the Naples area, but who ultimately was a Berber from North Africa. So he's into this whole cosmopolitan thing, and he teaches in the school that Theodore and Hadrian established in Canterbury initially, which is known to have had a syllabus of the liberal arts in the classical vein, and which used both Latin, Greek, and knew a little bit of Hebrew as well. And there's evidence that Bede, in the version of that Biscop and Chalfrith established in the north, that Bede benefited from that, and that he too had Greek and Latin and some knowledge and certainly an interest in Hebrew. He fixates a little in his works. He's very into Samuel, and he seems to equate those in the life of the abbots with his own father figure, Chalfrith. And that's partly because he sees himself of having been conceived in the womb and dedicated to be given to serve God. And so Chalfrith becomes his father figure within that, and his biblical exegesis really shows that. And of course, at one point, there were thought to have been about 600 monks in their high point in Bede's life in the two monasteries. I'm not quite sure what that data is based on, but that is the received wisdom. And at one point early on, only one young boy in his teens, we think, and Chalfrith were left alive to sing the Divine Office in the chancel at Jarrow, because of course this is one of the worst times to be alive in terms of plague, warfare, famine, other than the Black Death, and certainly far worse than probably COVID. And so when we look at that chancel area in Jarrow, I think that's a very powerful image to bear with us. Right, I'm going to shoot to the end now because there isn't time. But without the Northumbrian Renaissance, the Carolingian Renaissance would have been a longer time coming. Their inroads into Italy and opening up new libraries there, with Charlemagne's being declared Pope and crowned Pope, being declared Emperor and crowned by the Pope in the year 800 on Christmas Day, opens up a new orbit of material for them in Italy as well. But it's an important Renaissance. We're used to seeing the Renaissance, but the many Renaissances that precede it are very, very important. And amongst them all, the Northumbrian Renaissance shines as one of the most important and formative. And it's a fallacy to think that people like Bede would have a natural antipathy towards the work of earlier pagan authors. They would use anything that they found to be useful and to not overtly pull against Christian teachings. This is a copy of one of Pliny the Elder's work that was made in Northumbria in the 8th century, the sort of thing that Bede would have known as a text earlier. Aristotle's teachings, of course, had been lost to the West and preserved within Islam to be reintroduced during the during the 12th century. But Bede has no antipathy towards pagan authors. He praised that delightful book, The Natural History of Pliny. But when he writes his work on orthography and grammar, he will occasionally, if possible, if he's got a piece of pagan text or verse there that he thinks is a bit too racy, he'll substitute Prudentius, Sedulius, and Paulinus of Nola, Christian poets, and analyze their writing style and verse instead. This, for example, is a Northumbrian copy of Paulinus of Nola's songs that was used extensively in the continent as well. So, not time, but the role of Wearmouth, Jarrow and Lindisfarne in the transmission of sacred texts is a remarkably important one. The role in actually bringing together aspects of all of the different cultural traditions that we've talked about is an extremely important part of this. The interest in establishing stable legal and bureaucratic processes is also a very, very important one, and elevating the role of written text within the social construct is very important. The honour that is accorded to written words in an ecclesiastical context, of course, leads ultimately to the elevation of books such as the Lindisfarne Gospels, the Chad Gospels, the Book of Kells, as books which can function as symbolic places of meeting in which documents recording transmission of property, of lands, peace treaties possibly, and certainly manumission of slaves can all function. And it immediately begins to alter the perception of writing in the secular sphere. I'm going to whiz on from all of this far too much. And I just want to think at the end here, we look at some of the incredible artifacts and we think about the creation of the cult of Cuthbert and just how important Bede's work was in that. Again, Bede initially writes a verse life of Cuthbert, which is based on an anonymous life that's been written by one of the monks of Lindisfarne. Wilfrid's coterie pull it apart and find some glaring holes in it. So Bede then moves on to rewrite a prose life in which he interviews methodically members of the Lindisfarne community and others of those who had a direct contact. And he restructures it, and along with the Adfrith in the making of the Lindisfarne Gospels and the Vita, the prose Vita, they construct Cuthbert as a counter Beowulf figure, a Christian Marvel superhero, if you like, for a new age. Now, Codex Amiatinus, as we know, this isn't a book, it's a building. This is a library. Biblios means a library of scrolls. This question is, what text do you have in your library and what edition of those texts do you have in your library? And the great thing about the Chalfrith Bibles is that this is the most thoroughly researched, comprehensive thing. You can't use these books easily. You need 4 people to lift them. They are reference and symbolic copies of the research that has gone into establishing this. Now, if Bede's hand is one of them, which is it? Chalfrith's dedication inscription was, of course, erased once it got to Italy, and the name of a local Saint Peter Lombard was added instead. Christopher Hamill has argued that it never went to Rome. It did. The Pope writes back to Whitbert, Chalfrith's successor, saying that having looked at it, he can tell how Roman we are, and welcome to the Comitatus of St. Peter, with all the advantages that brings. And of course, Monte Amiato, where it ends up later in the century, was only founded 40 years or so after Chalfrith's visit. It may well be that the Pope gave it to Monte Amiato, which is on the English Via Francigena route over the Alps to Rome, because of that, but it certainly did reach Rome. And when we look at the prefatory diagrams that show symbolically, and I'm sure Bede is behind these, how the different books of the Bible relate to one another, how Christ serves as the rainbow bridge, linking the Old and New Testaments and transforming the reading of one by the other. Pentateuch description shown again as the wounds of Christ, the Torah reconceived as the wounds of Christ within the construct of the Celtic cross, and the diagrams of the temple and tabernacle, which are elucidated and commented on in Bede's own personal exegesis. The works of Cassiodorus, we know some of them are certainly available at Monmouth Jarrow. The Cassiodorus that you see on the right was made in Northumbria, possibly at Wearmouth Jarrow, shortly after Bede's day, and the Institutiones seem to have been known there. And this is, I think, close as I can get to Bede's handwriting. What is my premise for identifying one of the 7 hands? Well, very quickly, the marginal markup that you see here using Greek characters is consistent with the markup systems that Bede is devising at the time in order to articulate and show his research techniques. His lightning flashes occur in the parts of the text that I'm suggesting are his as well. There's a particular interest in Hebrew names that he highlights, etc. And the parts of the text that he's actually writing are the books of the Bible that he was engaged in actually writing commentaries on at that time, Ecclesiastes, the Book of Kings, etc. So it's like he's totally immersed. And of course, Cassiodorus and others said that while you're actually copying scripture, you go through a triple process of ruminatio, you chew over the meaning of the text, you then meditate on it. And if you're lucky, you get revelatio when you finally, for a moment, see the bigger picture. And I think we have here Bede engaging in that process and at the same time writing his incredibly deep perceptions of reading of scripture. Also, a number of the scribes write colophons at the end of their stints of work. Now, mostly they just write oro pro, so pray for me. They don't name themselves as scribes. This one, which I think is the Bede hand, when you can see some of his lightning flashes up, actually highlights one particular word at the end as the colophon. It's part of the text, but he's highlighted labore, to work. And his emphasis in his autobiographical note, and time again in his work, it's labore, the work. To work is to pray. Put all of those together, I think that for me, this is, and of course, Bede is probably one of the most proficient Greek scholars in the Wearmouth Jarrow Library and Hebrew, and he's showing an engagement with both here. The other thing that I wanted to discuss was, it's Bede telling me I've gone on too long. Okay, right, I am finishing. Okay, what about, just leave it, love. What about the idea of Bede's lost Gospel of John? Now, his amanuensis, Cuthbert, tells us that in the last couple of weeks of his life, he sat on his cell floor and he translated parts of the little gospel that speaks of the thing, the work of love, John's Gospel, to share with his own people in his own language. He previously suggested to the bishops that parish priests should be allowed to use the Paternoster and the Creed in English because they and their congregations couldn't understand Latin. He's a great advocate for early poetry. Our earliest Old English poetry to survive is because of its citing and possibly composition by Bede. And we know he did this, and he was also working on some difficult passages of, there's persistent, of Isidore. Now, I think the passages of Isidore, to judge from a copy of his ecclesiastical history, which belong to either Alcuin or Charlemagne, are passages that concern consanguinity. And a big problem in Bede's last few weeks is he's very worried about King Ceolwulf and the fact that he has been deposed. He's gone to live as a monk in Lindisfarne. He does then come back to the throne, but there's been some big scandal. They've used something to get him out. I wonder whether, because Alcuin or Charlemagne's copy actually goes into more detail about the problem of consanguinity and Isidore's role in elucidating that, whether that might have been something that was on his mind. But the biggest thing was how to share the visionary John, the gospel of the sick and the dying. Now, we thought we'd lost it. Some scholars think it never existed. I think we've still got it. As we know, the community subsequently leave Holy Island, not because it's too hot in the kitchen and they can't stand the Viking pressure, but because they become marginalised. The centre of power is now at Viking HQ in York, so they move initially to their most southerly house, Crape, near York, and then ultimately they go to Chester Street and then finally Durham. Now, in the 930s, Alfred the Great's grandson, Athelstan, visits them there as part of his policy of using the community of Cuthbert as part of the process of unification to form a united England. In the 950s, a scribe called Aldred joins the community. He gives them a nice payment of bullion as his dowry, and almost immediately he's allowed to improve the lead visible relic of Cuthbert, the Lindisfarne Gospels. In his colophon that you see here at the end of John's Gospel, he speaks about glossing one Gospel for God, one for Cuthbert and all the saints on the island, another for the community, and the last for the good of his own soul, with a payment of money. In his gloss throughout the Gospels, which is added in tiny little Old English script between the lines, we can see that his major concerns are those of the reforming party of Wessex: Athelwold, Dunstan, Oswald, Edgar. He will go off into 10-line glosses on aspects of the various concerns of that party. And although the Gospels is glossed in the Northumbrian dialect, I can't help thinking he's a bit of a parachuted in West Saxon, tame Northumbrian, if you like, who's actually reasserting the primacy of Old English at a time when it's probably no longer the first language of many members of the Northern Danelaw, and certainly those in power. And so you have, as a symbolic display on the high altar of the cult of St. Cuthbert, English joining Hebrew, Greek, Latin as the sacred language of Scripture. And this is said to be the earliest surviving translation of the Gospels into the English language. But of course, Bede is said to have done it earlier, in 735. Now, with all my work on Lindisfarne, it's often intrigued me why Aldridge uses a text Black Browning for all of the Gospels and most of John, but a number of parts of it are in red ink. Now, red is used to confer greater authority, status, and to draw your attention. Having analysed, with the help of some very wonderful specialists in Old English, the grammar, the punctuation, the rhetorical and linguistic constructs are all consistent with Bede's Old English literary style. And whereas Aldred has undertaken the work of glossing rather like a schoolroom exercise using a thesaurus, herring equals sardine, you couldn't print it out and have a continuous prose text. The sections in red you can. I think Aldred and the community of Cuthbert have preserved for us Bede's translation of John, which is embedded in the red ink within Aldred's gloss. And so once more, the origins of English and its use for the sacred text in the vernacular, free of the restrictions that Wycliffe and Tyndale would face in a less tolerant late medieval and early modern period, are saved for us here on the pages of the Lindisfarne Gospels, which Bede had a hand in actually inspiring and informing. Thank you.